Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Cut Rate Commander, the series where we take a look at low-price commanders and make budget decks with them. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at a build featuring the traitorous wizard, Saruman the White Hand. But before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content, and if you really like it, please consider supporting the channel directly through Buy Me a Coffee or through our Game Nerds affiliate link in the description. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see which commanders we'll be covering next, and what commanders you'll be voting for an upcoming episode. So, with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Saruman the White Hand is a 2/5 avatar wizard that costs 1 and Grixis that has the following 2 abilities. Firstly, whenever we cast a non-creature spell, we amass Orcs X, where X is that spell's CMC. And secondly, Orcs and Goblins we control have Ward 2. Breaking down his core stats, Saruman is sporting a mid-weight CMC, a very low power but above average toughness for his cost, and a pair of abilities that enable him to turn our non-creature spells into resilient board presence. Taking a closer look at his first ability, it essentially tacks on a free body to the first non-creature spell we cast while he's in play, then continues to grow that body with each subsequent non-creature spell we cast, which goes a long way towards shoring up the fairly typical weakness of having small board states that many Spellslinger builds innately have, by generating a free body for us that can easily grow into the double digits as we continue to sling our spells. That said, this ability is not without its flaws. Firstly, as it is a cast trigger, effects that copy but do not cast spells won't proc it with a copy of the spell they create, and secondly, unlike other payoffs that instead create individual bodies as we cast our spells, all that it will take to destroy our gigantic amassed orc army will be a single removal spell, overall making it quite vulnerable without giving it protection through other means. Luckily for us then, Saruman provides the army he creates with protection in the form of Ward 2, which admittedly is not the best targeting protection, but often is enough to make removing our army inefficient in all but the most dire of circumstances, generally buying them more time as our opponents use their removal against more immediate threats. So, quite fittingly, this version of Saruman is a commander that cares about casting spells in order to generate board presence via the gigantic orc army he can amass for us, making him an ideal commander for a Spellslinger build focused around weaponizing the army he brings to the table, which is exactly the direction we'll be taking him in this build. And as one might expect in a Spellslinger-focused build, we'll be running a fair number of non-creature spells to proc our commander's amass as often and as frequently as possible, ranging from a copious amount of modular instants to give us lots of options regardless of the state of the board, plenty of sorcery speed tutors to help us get our playmakers and support pieces out more reliably, and speaking of which, a solid backbone of Spellslinger payoffs to help us further build up our board presence and generate us value as we cast our spells. Then, coupled with various means to get us even more mileage out of our spells via effects that let us recur or recast them from the bin, and a handful of ways to further empower our orc army by amassing it even more or making it evasive, we'll be left with a build that any magic-fueled megalomaniac Dark Lord would be impressed with. So let us make our way to Middle-earth and travel deep into the pits of Isengard, where we'll find our commander, Saruman, weaving his dark magics to create the most brutal orcs to ever exist, the Uruk-hai. Countless in number and fully grown as they crawl out of their spawning pits like maggots, they are immediately armed with crude but devastatingly effective weapons and armor to join their master's army, each emblazoned with the symbol of the White Hand to leave no doubt in their enemy's mind that they face the pinnacle of the orcish race, empowered by the foul magics of their master and all too eager to cut down any army of men who stand in their way. So, now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's start looking at the deck itself by starting with the creatures. As one might expect in a Spellslinger build, since we'll be dedicating the majority of our deck to non-creature spells in order to enable our commander, the creature base in this build will be quite low, with its members primarily being used to either generate us more value as we cast our spells or to further empower our orc army. In the latter camp, we'll be running Archmage Emeritus and Stormkiln Artist as instant and sorcery payoffs that help pad our core stats via the repeatable draw and ramp they provide us with as we cast our spells, Jingataxis as another passive card advantage source that procs off most of our non-creature spells that we can also easily transform into the Great Synthesis thanks to all our draw sources, providing us with even more draw, a board wipe, and a gigantic volley of free spells as he does so, Dika Fractal Theorist and Chrome Host Seed Shark as more ways for us to turn our spell slinging into board presence by creating bodies that scale with our spell CMC, with the former also serving as a way for us to make our Orc army evasive so they can reliably get in for damage, and a third path Iconoclast, Young Pyromancer, and a Sedgemoor Witch as relatively cheap means for us to tack on even more board presence generation as we cast our spells to grow our board state even further. We'll then also be running Goblin Electromancer and Wizards of Thay as a pair of instant and sorcery cost reducers to allow us to cast our spells more frequently, thereby allowing us to grow our Orc army even faster, with the latter also allowing us to cast our sorceries at flash speed to give us even more flexibility with our spell casting, as well as Cast Dissident Mage, whose ability to let us cast our instants and sorceries from our bin once per rotation is superb as A way for us to get 2-for-1 usage out of the majority of our spells, and B, as a way for us to re-trigger all our payoffs again with resources from our graveyard for additional value. And then as the lone member of the latter camp and our last creature, we'll be adding Corsairs of Umbar to the build as another way to give true evasion to our Orc army, and if we have the mana to spare or can't swing in with our Orc army, as a way for us to further amass our horde by making itself evasive and amassing 3 as it gets in for damage. That covers all our creatures, so let's move on to our instants. Our instant category, considering it's going to be the backbone of this build, is unsurprisingly our largest one, where we'll be concentrating our efforts on running a vast array of modal effects to provide our deck with maximum flexibility while we amass our army. For example, on the cheaper side of things, Rakdos Charm will be slotted in as a well-costed source of artifact removal that also doubles as Graveyard Hate or AoE Burn to help us combat against graveyard or token-focused decks. Izzet Charm makes it in as even more reliable removal via its counterspell and shock that we can alternately use as card selection and graveyard setup if we need to dig for more resources. Croesus Charm, Grixis Charm, and Maestro's Charm all make the grade as even more destruction and non-destruction sources of removal that can deal with a variety of different threats, and can alternatively be used to provide utility outside of removal with effects like pumping our board, draining our opponents, and/or digging for more resources. An Archmage's Charm and You Find the Villain's Lair slot in as solid counter spells to help disrupt our opponent's plays that, even if we don't have spells to counter, can instead be used to steal our opponent's low CMC permanents or draw us cards in the former's case, or to provide card selection and graveyard setup in the latter's. Then moving on from spells that have us choose one mode to 2 instead, Colligan's Command makes it in as a solid source of removal for both smaller creatures and back row that can alternately be used as hand attack or creature recursion if needed, as does Prismari Command, which again provides the build with even more front row and back row removal as well as card selection and/or ramp depending on the situation. Then proceeding to our higher CMC entries, Cryptic Command makes the final cut as a fantastic source of spell disruption and permanent bouncing that we can also use to tap down an opponent's entire creature base to allow our army to swing in, and/or turn into a cantrip if we need to dig for more resources. Insidious Will earns a spot by giving us a variety of different ways to disrupt and/or take advantage of our opponent's spell casting via countering their spells, changing their spells' targets, or just creating a copy for ourselves to use. Kill, Maim, Burn makes it in as a 2-for-1 removal spell that throws in some burn for good measure to disrupt our opponent's board states and soften up their life totals, and a Sullumgar's Command earns a spot as well as even more removal that provides spell disruption, bounce, stat reduction, and/or planeswalker destruction in any combination we may need to ensure we can reliably deal with almost any type of threat we may encounter. And as our final wave of modal instants, we have Mystic Confluence and Wretched Confluence making the final build as highly customizable spells we can use as removal via spell disruption, bounce, and or stat reduction to deal with our opponent's plays, as card advantage to help reload our hands, and the latter even being usable as graveyard recursion to help us get our creatures back, and Perplexing Test wrapping up our modal spells as an instant speed board wipe that we can use to clear the board of non-tokens, and give our amassed army and any other tokens we may have a clear shot at our opponent's life totals to help close out games. Then, to give us a few more entries in this category without technically cutting into our land base, we'll be adding the MDFC's Kazul's Fury, Saloon Vision, and Hagara Mauling as spells we can use to make our land drops if we draw them early, and, if we draw them later, we can instead use them to either throw our orc army at our opponent's faces for a significant amount of burn, dig for more playmakers, or use them as targeted removal instead. Then moving on to our non-modular but still solid instance that made it into the build, we'll be running Wizard's Retort as a decent counter spell that, alongside our commander, we can cast for cheaper while still amassing 3, Chaos Warp and Bedevil as solid removal options that, while not truly modal, still provide a lot of flexibility to our removal package by dealing with a wide array of threats, and Quick Study as a serviceable source of instant speed draw that we can use to proc our commander and other payoffs on our opponent's turns for added value. The part card advantage, part graveyard setup suite, consisting of Sauron's Ransom, Factor Fiction, and Hostile Negotiations, will then also make it into the deck, thanks to not only providing us with instant speed draw, but also allowing us to set up our graveyard with Instants and Sorceries for our spell recursion sources to cast later for even more value. And then as another, more niche source of draw, we'll be including Commence the Endgame as a usually inefficient draw and amass source that actually works very nicely in this build, thanks to its naturally high CMC and our various other draw sources, allowing us to easily amass in the double digits to grow our army considerably in a single shot, all at flash speed. And finally, as our last instant entry, we'll be running Frantic Search as a quote-unquote free spell for us to use to amass our army, proc our payoffs, and dig deeper into our deck for more playmakers and payoffs, while setting up our spell recursion sources as it does so. That covers all our instants, so let's move on to our sorceries. Again, although not quite as robust as the previous category, this build will still contain a respectable amount of sorceries to help proc our commander and other payoffs more frequently, and will primarily consist of additional sources of card selection, card advantage, and a handful of tutors to improve the deck's overall consistency, alongside a handful of extra modal cards to make our spells even more flexible, and some amass-specific cards to take advantage of and empower our army. In the card selection department, the staple loot spell Faithless Looting makes it in as a very cheap source of card selection and graveyard setup to help smooth out our draws and set up our spell recursion sources, that also, thanks to Flashback, we can get double the use of without outside help to reproc all our payoffs. Then on the draw side of things, Deep Analysis makes the cut as another 2-for-1 flashback spell for added value that helps replenish our resources while amassing 4 twice alongside our commander, and Inspiring Refrain makes the grade as a high CMC spell that we can get continual use out of as a free amass 6 and draw 2 every 3 turns after we cast it, on top of allowing us to suspend it for 3 if we draw into it early to prevent it from breaking us. And then reaching our tutors, we'll be running Ring Sight, Diabolic Tutor, Mastermind's Acquisition, and a Dark Petition as reliable means for us to search up any of our playmakers directly to hand that our commander and spellslinger payoffs help take the edge off their slow speed by tacking on bodies and other forms of value as we cast them while we improve the build's consistency. Then for the modal sorceries we'll be running, we'll be slotting in Fiery Confluence as a decent removal source and wipe that can deal with artifacts and small to mid-sized creatures respectively, as well as deal a respectable amount of AoE burn to help us push for lethal, and making space for Maestro's Confluence for even more removal, this time non-destruction, as well as spell recursion to get our resources back, and Mass Go to rid ourselves of our opponent's blockers and allow our army to attack unimpeded. And lastly, to close out this slot, we'll be including a handful of amass-specific cards to build up our army alongside our commander, with Swarming of Moria making it in as what amounts to an amass 5 and a treasure for only 3 mana alongside our commander to empower our orcs while giving us ramp and fixing. Treason of Isengard also effectively being an amass 5 for 3 that helps us recur our instants and sorceries as well to get extra uses out of them. And Widespread Brutality wraps up this slot as a non-theme board wipe that, at minimum alongside our commander, will deal 6 damage to all other creatures to retake control of the board for us while clearing the way for it to swing in for massive damage. That covers all our sorceries, so let's move on to our enchantments. In contrast to our previous 2 categories, we'll only be running a handful of enchantments in this build, though it should be noted that despite their low quantity, they arguably contain the highest quality payoffs in the deck for both our army and our spells to get the absolute maximum usage out of them. Starting with our lone army empowering source first, Dreadhorde Invasion makes it in as a very cheap way to turn our ever-growing orc army into a source of continual life gain by granting them lifelink after a single turn, easily enabling them to generate a double-digit life gain with every swing while also passively growing them with each passing turn, making it quite difficult for our opponents to deal with us using conventional damage so long as we're able to keep our army alive. Then moving on to our spells matter payoffs, we'll be running Metallurgic Summonings as yet another source of scalable token creation to build up our board with, that, if needed, we can use as an emergency way to recur all our instants and sorceries from our bin if we find ourselves needing to replenish our hands, or to reuse our most powerful spells. And then as our last and arguably most powerful enchantment and card in the build, we have Arcane Bombardment, which, whenever we cast our first instant or sorcery spell each turn, exiles an instant or sorcery card at random from our graveyard, then copies each card exiled with Arcane Bombardment, letting us cast them at no mana cost, making it an absolute powerhouse in this build thanks to our high number of instant and modal spells allowing us to proc it on each player's turn, and making nearly any spell it hits castable, not only allowing us to drown our opponents in a torrent of spells, but also proccing all our spells matter payoffs more and more each time we proc it, though do keep in mind that the spells we cast off it are limited by timing restrictions, so unless we have or tutor up Wizards of Thay, we will be restricted to casting those spells on our turn if we hit them. That covers all our enchantments, so let's move on to our artifacts. Reaching the artifacts that we'll be adding to our build, it's going to be ramp sources all the way down in order to help us speed up and or fix our mana base. With our Mana Rock collection consisting of Sol Ring, Arcane Signet, Dimir Signet, Izzet Signet, Rakdos Signet, Talisman of Creativity, Talisman of Dominance, Felwar Stone, Mind Stone, and a Decanter of Endless Water, all of which serve as cheap sources of ramp for us to build up our mana base in the early game while also amassing our army alongside our commander, with the last entry also removing our maximum hand size limit so we can take full advantage of all our draw sources, and the land ramp source Wayfarer's Bauble also joining us as even more cheap ramp and fixing to ensure we always have the mana we'll need to be able to reliably cast all our multi-pip spells. That covers all our artifacts, so let's move on to our land base. Quickly going over our mana lands, we'll be running Command Tower and Crumbling Necropolis as lands that tap for all our colors to help improve consistency. The check lands Dragon Skull Summit, Drowned Catacomb, and Sulphur Falls, the battle lands Smoldering Marsh and Sunken Hollow, and the reveal lands Choked Estuary, Foreboding Ruins, and Frostboil Snarl as dual lands that take advantage of our relatively high number of basics to come into play untapped, providing even more reliable access to our colors without sacrificing speed, and the Pain lands, Shivan Reef and Sulphurous Springs, as one last means for us to reliably cast our multi-pip spells, this time that always come into play untapped so we always have access to that mana whenever we may need it. Then for utility lands, we'll be including the Amass-focused Barad-dûr to give us the option to spend our mana to pump our Orc army if we don't need that mana to cast our spells, which works particularly well with the copious amount of removal we'll be running in order to proc it, as well as the evasion-granting Rogue's Passage to provide the build with one last means to make our Orc army evasive so they can put their massive stat block to use. And finally, we'll be running 9 islands, 5 swamps, and 5 mountains as our basics to round out our mana base. So, now that we've covered all the cards in the deck, let's take a look at this deck's breakdown. This deck currently has 13 creatures including our commander, 28 instants, 12 sorceries, 3 enchantments, 11 artifacts, 0 planeswalkers, and 36 lands including 3 MDFCs. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 54 non-creature spells, 40 of which are instants or sorceries, 4 cards that care about any kind of non-creature spell, and 13 cards that specifically care about instants and sorceries, 13 cards that either amass or create other types of creature tokens, 5 ways to recur our instants and sorceries from the graveyard, 4 tutor effects, and 3 ways to grant our creatures evasion, giving us a very solid spell slinger build with plenty of spells and payoffs for us to use to grow our board with token bodies, a decent number of ways for us to search up and reuse our primary playmakers, and, when our army reaches critical mass, a handful of ways to ensure that no blockers will be able to get in their way as they crash in. Then for general deck stats, we have 16 ramp sources, 12 card draw sources, 22 targeted removal sources, and 4 board wipes. Our ramp being slightly higher than normal to ensure we can reliably cast our high CMC and multi-pip spells, while our targeted removal is through the roof due to such a large number of our spells doubling as removal thanks to their modular nature, allowing us to use them to deal with threats if and when we need to for additional flexibility. Then looking at our mana curve, we have 3 1-drops, 14 2-drops, 21 3-drops, 16 4-drops, 9 5-drops, and 4 6-drops, leaving us with a mid-weight curve that aims to get our commander and other payoffs on board as fast as possible, and, once we have them in play, to cast spells as quickly as possible to trigger them as often as we can, especially on our opponent's turns to disrupt them. Then from there, we can either amass our army and assorted creature tokens to critical levels and swing in with them, preferably while making our army evasive for massive damage, or instead dig for or tutor up Arcane Bombardment, and then proceed to cast a spell on each turn to trigger it over and over again on each player's turn to drown our opponents in a torrent of spells that keep proccing all our payoffs, and often being more than capable of doing both. Currently, this deck is valued at $65.49, not counting the price of basic lands or shipping. This price was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For side grades, if we'd rather add some spell-based burn to the build instead of token creation, we can exchange out Young Pyromancer, Third Path Iconoclast, and Sedgemoor Witch for Firebrand Archer, Kessig Flame Breather, and Gutter Snipe to whittle down our opponent's life totals as we cast our spells at the cost of losing out on board presence. Sauron's Ransom can be traded for Solve the Equation if we'd rather add consistency to the build through more tutoring effects, overdraw, and graveyard setup, and Dark Petition can be replaced with Windfall if we'd rather have more draw and less tutors in the build instead. Then for upgrades, you find the Villain's Lair can be cut in favor of the better modal spell Flame of Anur, which provides very well costed removal and or draw that we can select 2 options from so long as we control our commander. Maestro's Confluence can be slotted out so we can slot in Shark Typhoon, which serves as another spell's matter payoff that creates scalable, this time evasive tokens to further grow our board with, and we can terraform one of our basic swamps into the Black Gate to give us yet another way to make our Orc army evasive so it can crash in with its massive stat block while ignoring blockers. And lastly, we can upgrade our tutor package by cutting the decent Ring Sight, Diabolic Tutor, and Mastermind's Acquisition to make room for the significantly more powerful Demonic Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, and its functional reprint, Imperial Seal, all of which massively improve our build's consistency at a criminally low mana cost. Though sadly, the only thing they won't be able to find us is the money we'll need to actually play them in our build. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. Before we continue, I would first like to take a moment to thank all of the channel subscribers for having helped us reach the 14.4k subscriber milestone. We're on the home stretch for 15k and it's all thanks to your support. So sincerely, thank you all for having gotten us here. Now, taking a look at our upcoming builds, next week's build will feature the possible god too good to stand up against the Dark Lord, Tom Bombadil, helming a 5-color saga-focused build, and, after him, last week's poll winner, Alayla Cunning Conqueror, will be getting a build of her own to lead that's all about flash speed casting, so look forward to those builds coming soon. Then moving on to this week's poll, it's time for us to start looking at the main set's new commanders instead of just the precons. And who better to start us off than the 3 witches responsible for the wicked sleep that started off this whole mess on Eldraine. Of course that means this week's contenders will be the aura-focused Ariette of the Charmed Apple, the activated ability-focused Agatha of the Vile Cauldron, and the tap-down-focused Hilda of the Icy Crown. So please, cast your votes in the community tab, link in the description, and let me know in the comments who you voted for and which commanders you want to see featured in future polls. And lastly, before we close out, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel can't continue to grow without your support. And if you're feeling particularly generous, feel free to keep me caffeinated via buying me a coffee at the link in the description, or alternatively, use our Game Nerds affiliate link in the description if you're looking to purchase sealed MTG product, accessories, board games, or any of their other wide selection of products at low prices that include free shipping for orders over $75, and a rewards program that builds up store credit over time as you make your purchases. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.